France's President Sarkozy wasn't kidding when he said that Europe can and will act. The package announced in the Eurozone is absolutely massive. Taking everything together that's been announced in recent weeks, we are now at about $1 trillion in support of the markets in Europe. And that's just on the fiscal side. On the monetary side, the European Central Bank has also stepped in. But let's take a step back and see what is being done here. On the fiscal side, a fund is being set up to bail out anybody who's asking for help. Germany has insisted that anybody who does ask for help will get IMF involvement as well. In Greece, we have seen what that means. That should be quite a deterrent for any country to approach the Eurozone and actually ask for help. And we've seen very strong steps on the fiscal side as well. Italy, Portugal, Spain, all have announced further severe budget cuts. This year about 0.5 to 1% of their respective GDPs. Next year about the same range. Now all of these programs, they have been announced, but they are not implemented yet. There is still some haggling over the details, and it may take weeks before we see these programs actually in place. That may well be the one reason why the European Central Bank has jumped in and reopened emergency facilities. Any bank that wants to have access to funding can get so from the European Central Bank on a 6-month basis. That will be through select auctions. A swap line for any bank that requires US dollars has also been reopened with the Federal Reserve. And then, most noteworthy, the European Central Bank has announced that it may engage in both corporate and sovereign debt purchases to what they call is enhance the depth and the liquidity in the markets. Any such actions will be sterilized, the ECB says. Now what does that mean? First of all, the sterilization part. The European Central Bank, unlike the Federal Reserve, is allowed to issue its own debt. The Federal Reserve has been fighting for that for some time, but at this stage the Federal Reserve is not allowed to do that. That means when the European Central Bank buys the debt of any one country, it says it will simultaneously issue its own debt. That means the net effect on the overall money supply, on the monetary base, on the money available to the markets, may be unchanged. However, if the European Central Bank goes beyond what it says, rather than just providing depth and liquidity, a terminology that it's borrowed from the Federal Reserve's credit easing programs, then it may well be that the yields in the Eurozone will be artificially depressed. Now, while that may be cheery for the markets in the short term, the big challenge with that is that the most powerful mechanism to impose fiscal discipline in the markets are the bond markets. It is because the bond markets are out of control right now that the European governments are forced to engage in fiscal consolidation to have these cost cuts. So the fear is that the more help these markets are getting, the less of an incentive there will be to engage in these very, very necessary structural reforms. Right now, what we are achieving is we are addressing the liquidity issues. What we are not addressing are the solvency issues, meaning that countries that have spent too much have too much debt. While that debt is not going away anytime soon, what happens is that these countries are buying time. Let's take Greece as an example. Any country is able to default on its debt overnight if they wanted to. The challenge with defaulting on your debt is that you will not have access to the credit markets the day after you default because nobody wants to give you money. In the case of Greece, that would require about a 15% adjustment to the GDP overnight, something that Greece thinks is unbearable, quite rightfully so. As a result, as some people have pointed out, Greece will promise the moon in order to get the money from the European Union, and that has in the meantime been arranged that they will get the money from the European Union as well as from the IMF. But in a couple of years down the road, when Greece has implemented many of its reforms, and one can argue how efficient they will be, but they will implement quite a bit, maybe not everything that they promise. Well, if they default a couple of years down the road, possibly of another round of aid, what will happen is that the shock to the Greek economy will be far less. That means at that time, in 3 years or so, it might be worthwhile for Greece to default, because the adjustment to their GDP will be only about 3% of GDP or 4% of GDP, something that is still harsh, but that the country may be able to stomach and may get in return for wiping out a good chunk of its debt. So the time in the coming years will have to be used for the banking system in the Eurozone, in the world, to become robust enough to stomach defaults of the sort that may or will be coming for countries like Greece. Similarly, the countries that are not in Greece's position will have to take very serious steps in order to address their fiscal situation. And we're seeing steps in that direction. That is a step. That is not all that's needed. So more consolidation will be needed. What does this all mean for the currency markets? Well, the euro had been under severe pressure because of the turmoil. The announcements were far more significant than many people had anticipated. We believe that at the very least there should be a very strong relief rally. Having said that, looking beyond that, the issues that we see in the Eurozone are not Euro-specific problems. These are global issues. Most countries in the world have spent too much money. We believe the UK, the US, Japan might be in worse situation than the Eurozone is, and indeed we continue to believe that it's more difficult to spend and print money in the Eurozone than in other countries. There are no easy answers to this. There is no such thing as a safe asset anymore, and investors may want to take a diversified approach to something as mundane cash. Central banks are diversifying to baskets of currencies. Investors may want to consider doing the same. I'm Axel Merk, the President and Chief Investment Officer of Merk Investments, manager of the Merk Mutual Funds.